Thank you all for coming today to celebrate this special occasion with us. Growing up, I didn't have a single happy memory because I was raised by a single mom. My ex-husband chuckled next to me, clearly amused by our son's wedding speech. My son's wedding speech continues. My dad, whom I love dearly, was taken away from me. I was never told why my parents divorced. And no matter what I asked for, it was never bought for me. I don't want my future children to ever feel this way. And not wanting her to be a single mom was my ex-husband, the only one who applauded our son's speech about wanting to make his wife happy. Flashback to over a decade ago. I, Emily, chose to divorce my husband, Mason, due to his incessant cheating. Or rather, I had no other choice, because he had left me for another woman and hardly ever came back home. Our son Jackson, who was in elementary school at the time, was a daddy's boy, much to my dismay. Mason might have been a terrible husband, but he was a fantastic dad. He'd buy Jackson any toy he wanted and take him anywhere he wished to go. While I was relieved to be rid of a terrible husband, Jackson had to experience the loss of a fantastic dad, and our relationship became strained. Mason was never a big earner. Despite this, he dipped into our savings to shower gifts on his mistress and buy games for Jackson, leaving us with next to nothing after the divorce. He was estranged from his own parents, so he had almost no ability to pay alimony or child support, leaving me with very little. So I had no choice but to work full-time after the divorce. Working full-time meant I often picked up Jackson late from after-school care. He would complain, "I'm always the last one here because my mom can't come home early." "I'm sorry, Jackson. Mom is doing her best, so I need you to do your best too." "I don't want to. Why did Dad have to leave? I want to go live with him." Every time Jackson said this, all I could say was, "I'm sorry." Mason, who had once doted on Jackson, never fought for custody. He even said that Jackson would be a hindrance to his new life with his mistress. I couldn't bring myself to tell Jackson the selfishness of his dad, so I kept the reason for our divorce from him for years. Jackson, who had been spoiled by Mason, always wanted the latest trendy toys, but I couldn't afford to buy them all. I wasn't sure if it was because he liked Mason or because of how Mason raised him, but Jackson had a selfish streak. I wanted to teach him the value of patience. "Mom, I want this game. Buy it for me," Jackson would often say. "I'll get it for you on your birthday," I'd reply. Whenever I explained that I couldn't buy expensive things for no special reason, Jackson would pout and say, "Fine, Mom, I'll just ask Dad to get it for me." He'd always turn to Mason for indulgence. During their monthly visits, Jackson would ask Mason for all sorts of things, and Mason would oblige, leaving me frustrated. I was always the bad guy in this scenario. I messaged Mason, asking him to stop spoiling Jackson, but he ignored me. The man who never stopped cheating, despite my tears, wasn't going to stop just because I asked him to on WhatsApp. Jackson's rebellious phase was a nightmare. He'd go out at night, break school rules, and I lost count of how many times I had to apologize to his teachers. But as time passed, I found myself cherishing those difficult days, pouring love into raising Jackson. Eventually, Jackson became an adult and one day brought home his girlfriend, Charlotte. Charlotte was a junior colleague at my workplace. There were men at our office. They were mostly older. Charlotte often complained, "There's no one to date here." So I showed her a picture of Jackson and said, "If you're interested, I can introduce you to my son." She was surprisingly keen. Jackson also had a positive reaction to Charlotte's photo. I gave them each other's contact information and left it to them. Before I knew it, they were a couple and came to our house looking serious. I was a bit anxious as I served coffee to Charlotte and Jackson. The two of them coming to the house together like this could only mean one thing. They were thinking of getting married. My hunch was right. Jackson, looking a bit shy, said, "Actually, we're thinking of getting married." "There's a baby on the way," Charlotte added, smiling and rubbing her flat belly. I hadn't expected this, but I was thrilled. "Oh, that's wonderful," I exclaimed, and we all celebrated by eating the cake I had prepared. Despite the challenges of raising a rebellious Jackson, I felt a sense of relief, as if my parenting journey had finally come to an end. Jackson and Charlotte wanted to have their wedding ceremony before her pregnancy became too apparent. Everything moved smoothly towards the wedding. A meeting of both families was quickly arranged, and we greeted Charlotte's parents. The meeting took place in a private room at a restaurant. Meeting Charlotte's parents for the first time, it was clear they were as warm and kind as she was. Charlotte talked about how her parents had raised her and introduced her own parents to everyone. When it was Charlotte's turn to introduce her parents, she said, mixing in some humor, "These are my wonderful parents. I hope they get along well with Miss Emily." Then it was my turn to be introduced. As I nervously wondered what would be said, Jackson pointed at me and simply said, "This is my mom." That's it. Charlotte and her parents looked stunned, but I was the most shocked of all. I had raised Jackson as a single mom, doing my best, and all he had to say was that? Feeling both sad and frustrated, I tried to lighten the mood. "I'm sorry, my son is a bit shy." Charlotte chimed in, Yes, Jackson is really shy," desperately trying to smooth things over. Jackson didn't bother to read the room and just kept eating his meal. I couldn't help but feel sad, wondering if this was how I had raised him. Then came the day of the wedding ceremony. It was a hurried affair due to Charlotte's pregnancy, but many guests came, and it felt like a good ceremony. However, I wish they had thought more about the seating arrangement. Would anyone normally seat their divorced husband, Mason, next to them? Though we had been in touch via WhatsApp, seeing Mason in person after so long was irritating. He casually said, "Hey, how have you been?" Remembering the days when I cried holding a young Jackson because of Mason's infidelity, I coldly replied, "Fine," and ignored him for the rest of the event. Mason, getting drunk, kept talking to me. "You never noticed I was cheating, even before we got married. Jackson has my genes, you know. Wouldn't it be weird if he had another woman? Are there no women among Jackson's guests?" I doubt anyone but Mason would bring up such a topic at a wedding ceremony. My irritation built up seeing Mason, red-faced and drunk, scanning the guests. But this was a celebration. For Jackson's sake, I held back my urge to yell. The ceremony proceeded without a hitch, and finally it was time for Jackson's speech. Both families stood near the exit as Jackson took a microphone from a staff member. Under the spotlight, what would Jackson say? As I waited nervously, Jackson began. "Thank you for all coming today to celebrate this special occasion with us. Growing up, I didn't have a single happy memory because I was raised by a single mom." "Excuse me?" I couldn't help but blurt out. As Mason chuckled next to me. Jackson continued his speech. "My dad, whom I love dearly, was taken away from me. I was never told why my parents divorced, and no matter what I asked for, it was never bought for me. I don't want my future children to ever feel this way." Charlotte didn't want to be a single mom. The only person who applauded Jackson's speech about marrying her to ensure her happiness was Mason. The atmosphere in the room turned icy. I looked at Mason, who had entered my field of vision with a heavy heart. Mason was smirking, saying, "Yeah, well said." I felt a mix of anger and sadness for all that Jackson had done to me. Being disregarded during the family meeting, seated next to Mason during the wedding ceremony, and now being openly insulted. None of it was forgivable. Though I muttered to myself, "Brace yourself," as I was paralyzed by sadness and regret. The one who moved was Charlotte. "Jackson's speech just now was a terrible mistake." Charlotte snatched the microphone from Jackson and pleaded desperately. Miss Emily, Jackson's mom, is an incredible woman. She's the first woman in our company to become a department head. In fact, I had climbed the corporate ladder despite being a woman. Jackson probably didn't know because he never cared about my career. Department head? Mom is? Jackson's surprised voice was drowned out by my subordinates, led by Benjamin, who stood up. Yes, Miss Emily treats everyone fair and is an amazing boss. She never had a day when she didn't think about her son, Jackson, even while raising him. Benjamin, who had worked with me for years, knew I had juggled work and parenting. I was deeply touched that he valued my efforts. Charlotte glared at Jackson and said through the microphone, I will divorce Jackson. What? Why? Because someone who doesn't appreciate or even try to understand his mom's efforts can't be trusted to value a wife and a child. Being a single mom doesn't mean the child will be unhappy. That's just your misconception. I will return all the congratulatory gifts we received today. I apologize for the inconvenience after you've all come this way. Someone said, Well said. And applause followed. Jackson looked bewildered, his face pale, while Charlotte stood tall and looked stunning. Guests began to leave the wedding venue, and Mason had also disappeared. Left behind were just me and Charlotte's parents. Charlotte's dad was red-faced with anger. When I said, I apologize for Jackson, he kindly replied, You have nothing to apologize for. Charlotte said, Let's go. And we left the wedding venue. Jackson was left in the lobby shouting, Why is this happening? He looked pitiful and miserable. Charlotte and Jackson did end up divorcing. Jackson had already moved in with Charlotte and initially planned to return to my house, his childhood home. However, I had moved without telling him, leaving him without a place to go. A troubled Jackson called me. Mom, where are you? I can't just lose my childhood home like this. Jackson, have you ever had a happy moment being raised by me? If not, there's no point in living together now. I won't tell you where I am. Don't say that, Mom. Living alone is lonely. His voice sounded like he was about to cry. I wavered, but remembered his speech and decided we shouldn't live together. You loved Dad, right? Go live with Mason. It's better if you stay out of my life for your own happiness. Mom, wait. That speech was just a joke. I didn't raise a son who would make such a joke at a moment like that. Goodbye. Take care. After hanging up, I blocked Jackson's number. Cutting ties with my son was sad, but I felt somewhat relieved after all the terrible things he'd done to me. I heard from Mason that Jackson took my advice and visited him. Mason, who had just broken up with his girlfriend, welcomed Jackson. But two selfish people living together couldn't last long. Mason would get drunk every night and insult Jackson, leading to nightly arguments. Mason even borrowed money from Jackson's wallet and gambled it all away, causing Jackson to storm out. Mason said, I don't need a tight-fisted son like that. After all I bought for him, he makes a fuss over a little money. So it's unlikely Mason will help Jackson in the future. I don't know where he is now, but it seems he's truly alone. In contrast, I was enjoying my life. Charlotte often visited with her newborn, Ava. Please teach me how to be a single mom, Charlotte said. The first lesson is not to raise a selfish son like that, I replied, and Charlotte laughed. I think of Ava as adorable and Charlotte as a daughter. I've continued to interact with Charlotte's parents, and we've even gone on short trips together. Parenting is harder than I thought. You're amazing for doing it alone, Miss Emily, Charlotte often says. I simply reply, thank you, without any false modesty. If I downplayed it, I'd be negating all the hard work I'd put in back then. The efforts that neither my husband nor my raised son acknowledged. I might as well acknowledge them myself. Watching Ava grow little by little alongside Charlotte has become one of my joys in life, and I feel truly happy about it.